Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirala Greenwald. This is a Sicha from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Ches, Parsha Shelach, Sicha Aleph. And the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha we learned the pasuk of Shelach L'cha Anoshim, and we learned the teaching of Rashi on these three words. And there are four parts in the Sicha. The Rebbe will, number one, ask 6 questions on Rashi. Number two, explain that there's an essential question that's bothering Rashi over here, which is the key to understanding this Rashi. Number three, answer the 6 questions on Rashi. And number four, present the Inyanim, Mufloim, and Halacha, which are in this Rashi. In the beginning of the parsha, so Rashi quotes the word Shlach L'cha Anoshim, and he explains Lam Nismacha Parshas Meraglim and Parshas Miriam. Why did the Torah put this parsha, this story of the Meraglim, near the parsha, near the story of Miriam, which is right at the end of the previous parsha of Baal Yisra? And Rashi answers, Lefisha Loksal Iske Diba, since Miriam was punished because of Iske Diba, Shedibra Be'achia, that she spoke about her brother Moshe Rabbeinu, Risham Halalu, and these Rishayim the Meraglim, Ro, they saw this, V'loy Lokhu Musar, and they did not take a lesson. And there are 6 questions here. The first question is, as we spoke many times, from the fact that Rashi only explains the smichas of various parshias in a few places, and not every time we have parshias that are near one another, and there's explanation for it in Chazal, so this proves that it's not a question of Pshut Mikra, why the parshias are close to one another. And especially it won't be a question if the 2 parshias are in the order that the events occurred. And so Rashi will only explain to us the smichas of the parshas if there is some type of difficulty with it, or if by explaining it, it'll answer some other question that there is in Pshut Mikra. Based on this, there's a difficulty over here, which is that if so, since the story of the Meraglim happened the day after the story of Miriam ended on Chav Ches Sivan, and the story of the Meraglim began on Chav Tes Sivan, so what's the question over here? The 2 parshas are near one another, and it fits perfectly in terms of the order of the events, in the terms of the chronology of when the events occurred. The second question is, why does Rashi say about Miriam that Shelach on what? Why was she punished? Al iske diba. Why doesn't Rashi say on Lashon Hara, like he indeed says elsewhere that Miriam was punished for speaking Lashon Hara? And this question is especially since Rashi later explains that diba, the speech of diba, can be good or bad. So there's no indication over here that she spoke badly. So Rashi should have better said Shelach al Lashon Hara. The third question is, why does Rashi add over here Shadibra Ba'achia? What's the difference who she spoke about? The main thing is to say that Lafisha Loksal Iska Diba, that she was punished for the way she spoke, and these Rishayim saw and didn't take a lesson. Why does Rashi have to tell us who she spoke about? The fourth question is, why does Rashi say Urishayim Halalu? He could have just said Vahim. We know who we're talking about over here. We're talking about the Meraglim. So Rashi should have said Lefisha Loksal Iske Diba, Shadibra Ba'achia, Vahim, and they, the Meraglim, Ro v'leilak chumusar. Why does Rashi say Rishayim halalu and these Rishayim? The fifth question is, why does Rashi say Rishayim halalu Ra'u? They saw v'leilak chumusar and they didn't take a lesson. Why doesn't Rashi rather say Ra'u musar? They saw a lesson v'lei shamru and they didn't guard it. Like we see elsewhere in Chumash, that's what it says. It speaks about seeing a lesson and then guarding it, keeping it. And the sixth question is, why does Rashi also quote in the Dibra Maschal the words L'cha Anoshim? Rashi should have just quoted the word Shlach, like in the previous parsha where Rashi explains to us the closeness of the 2 parshias of the Chanukas Hanasiim and the Menorah. Rashi quotes the word Ba'aleischa and says his teaching. So also here Rashi should have just quoted the word Shlach and say his teaching. And as we'll see later in the Sicha, there's going to be another question which the Rebbe answers on Rashi, which is, why does Rashi say the word Ra'u? Rashi could have just said, Rishayim halalu loy lakhu musar. These Rishayim didn't take a lesson from Miriam. So as we'll see later, there will be a 7th question that is going to be answered as well. So we'll be able to understand this Rashi and answer all of our questions on Rashi by first discussing the question of the Ramban. The Ramban asks, why was the sin of the Meraglim so great? Their shluchus was to investigate Esa Aretz Mahi, Vesa Oma Yeshav Alea, Hechazaku Gamer, Uma He'arim Gamer. They were sent to investigate the land, the people, the cities. So what was their sin by saying the truth of what they saw? They described as the people are very mighty, and the cities are well fortified and they're very large. What was their sin? As the Ramban says, Ma pisham uma chatasam. They were sent to investigate and to report, and that's what they did. And to explain this question, we're going to negate some possible answers. We can't answer that their sin was that they said that it's a Eretz Eichelis Yeshveh, or their conclusion of Leinu Chalalis, that we're not going to be able to go up and conquer the land. Because as the Ramban says, he addresses these possible answers, that even before they said these words about it's a Eretz Eichelis Yeshveh and Leinu Chalalis, Kalev already intervened, and as the Torah tells us, Vayas Kalev Esa'am Geimer. So it's understood from this that their earlier words, where they just describe the land and the people and the cities, were already a sin. And so the question is, what's the sin over there? Furthermore, even their later words of Leinucha Lales can have a limit schus, because they said Leinucha Lales. They didn't say Leinale, which would be against the tzivui of Hashem. We're not going to go up. They just said we can go up. And the explanation is that according to their estimation of the strength of the Yidden and the strength of the people of the land, the Yidden don't have the ability in nature to conquer Eretz Yisrael. So they're just reporting what their investigation found, but they weren't saying therefore what to do. And even they're saying that Chazaku Mimenu, which Rashi explains, and it's brought down that it means Kivyachol Klape Maila Omru. They said it's about Hashem, that they're stronger Kivyachol than Hashem even. It isn't the denial in Hashem's ability, because they were reporting that the might of the nations is so great that it's impossible to imagine conquering them even through miracles. And as we indeed see from the response of Kalev, what did Kalev say? Afilu b'shamayim, even if it's in the heavens that we have to go there, Hashem says, make ladders and go up there. We're going to succeed in everything that Hashem says, which this is a type of thing that it's beyond even a miracle. So even when they said Chazaku Mimenu, we could explain it to mean that they were saying that it's such an impossibility that they can't even see it happening through miracles. But they weren't saying what we should therefore do, that therefore we shouldn't go up. So they're just reporting. So even what they said later could be explained. And so our question is, what was so terrible about what the Meraglim did? And Rashi answers this question with his teaching at the beginning of the parsha of Lama Nismacha. So it comes out that when Rashi asks Lama Nismacha, he's giving us an explanation of Lama Nismacha, but in the process he's also answering this question, which is what was so terrible about the Chet HaMeraglim. And with this in mind, we're about to go back to the Rashi and answer all of the questions. So now we're going to move on to answering the questions, and we're going to begin by answering questions 1 and 6. So the explanation of this is as follows. The reason Rashi asks Lama Nismacha, so we explained the reason Rashi is asking this question is in order to answer this larger question about what was so terrible about the Aveira of the Meraglim. But the question of Lama Nismacha itself has to make sense. So the reason Rashi asks Lama Nismacha, even though the story of the Meraglim happened the day after the story of Miriam, so it makes sense that these two parshas are near one another. The reason he asks it is because according to Pshuto Shemikra, we have to sometimes make a separation between two parshas, even when they chronologically follow one another. And this is similar to what Rashi explains by the parsha of Vayibin Sayarin. Rashi says, "V'lama nichtav kan." Why is this parsha of Vayibin Sayarin written here in Parshas Balaischa? Kedei lahafsik ben puranos lepuranos, in order to separate between the two bad events that are written here. So, in order to separate between these two bad events that they shouldn't be written right next to one another, the Torah interrupts with the parsha of Vayibin Sayarin. So we see that even when two events may otherwise fit to be written next to one another, but there could be a reason to need to separate between them. And so similarly here, when one learns these two parashas of Miriam and of the Meraglim, one after the other, so since they both speak about a matter of Lashon Hara, so a person may make a terrible mistake and think that Miriam and the Meraglim are chas v'shalom on the same or at least a similar level. And even though we see the extreme difference between them in the results, by Miriam, even after the punishment of Atisagir Miriam, we learn that Miriam, the whole nation waited for her. And this is a special honor that Hashem gave her. Whereas by the Meraglim, by them themselves, it was by Musa for they died. And that whole generation, Yiplu Bamidbar, died in the Midbar. And even Uvnechem, the ones that would end up in Eretz Yisrael, they remained in the Midbar for 40 years. But still, even though we see this extreme difference in the results, we can say that this isn't because the Meraglim were Rishayim, but rather because all the Yidden ended up rebelling against Hashem through not being careful with their speech. So we could say what they did itself is similar to what Miriam did. It's just that the punishment is so great because what they did led to something terrible, whereas by Miriam was a private matter. So we'll say the only difference is that since the story of the Meraglim was a public matter, so it led to this terrible thing. Whereas by Miriam was a private matter, nothing terrible ended up coming out of it, and that's why the consequences weren't so bad. And this is actually the reason. This is also the reason that Rashi also quotes the words in the beginning in his Dibra Maschal. He quotes the words L'cha Anoshim, because this strengthens the possibility of a person making this mistake. So why does Rashi? This is answering the sixth question. Why does Rashi also quote the words L'cha Anoshim? Because he's explaining to us over here with these words why it's important to separate these two parashias, because a person may make a mistake and think that they're similar. And the words L'cha Anoshim strengthen the possibility for making a mistake, because L'cha Anoshim, those two words emphasize the greatness of the Meraglim, because the Meraglim were sent L'cha, which means L'daitcha of Moshe, on such an important shlichus. So this shows that they were the greatest of people. And therefore that's why they were actually deserving of being called Anoshim, which as Rashi says, it means Loshen Chashivus, Ksherim Hayu, that they were great people. And so Rashi quotes these two words to emphasize that Lama Nismacha, why were they written next to one another? A person can make a mistake and think they're similar. And the words L'cha Anoshim emphasize that point and make it more likely to make the mistake, because those words communicate to us and teach us that the Meraglim were very great. And in order to negate such a mistake and to make it clear that the Meraglim aren't on a similar level of Miriam, so the Torah should have separated between the two parashias. And therefore Rashi asks, Lama Nismacha Parshas Meraglim, the Parshas Miriam. So now we understand Rashi's question, and we understand why he quotes the words L'cha Anoshim. Now we're going to move on to answering questions number 4 and 5. Question number 4 is, why does Rashi say Urishayim Halalu? Why doesn't he just say Vehem, and they Ra'u v'lei lakhu musar? And also, why does Rashi say Ra'u v'lei lakhu musar? Why doesn't he say, like the Torah says elsewhere, Ra'u musar, they saw a lesson, v'lei shamru, and they didn't keep it, they didn't guard it? So Rashi answers this question of his, of why did the Torah put these two parashas together, by saying, L'fi shalaksa al iskei diba shadibra b'achia, Rishayim halalu Ra'u v'lei lakhu musar. The Torah puts these two parashas near one another, even though it could lead to this mistake, to teach us the greatness of the sin of the Meraglim, which also explains why they received such a tremendous punishment. It wasn't just because of the results of what they did. It's because of their terrible sin, which is that they just had an opportunity to learn a lesson, and loy lakhu musar. They just had the opportunity. It was right in front of them to see how they should behave, and they did not take the lesson. And the lesson wasn't something that they could learn through thinking deeply about it, but rather was right there for the taking. That's why Rashi says, Loy lakhu musar, not they didn't loy shomer, they didn't guard it. That Ra'u musar v'loy shomer. It says Vehem Ra'u, they saw it, v'loy lakhu musar, they didn't take the lesson. Rashi's coming to tell us that it was there for the taking. And when we're saying this, we're saying that they saw and they didn't take a lesson, so this shows us that the sins were in the same category, as we'll explain in the next section of the Sikha, how the two Averis of Miriam and the Meraglim were similar. And that's why Rashi writes, Urishayim halalu, in order to clarify that the similarity of the two events is only in regards to the sin. However, regarding the people involved, the Meraglim were not just sinners, but they were Rishayim halalu. Rashi says Rishayim halalu to tell us that they're completely different than Miriam, the total opposite of Miriam, who we just learned about her, that covered Chelek la'amokim. So we answered those two questions. Why does Rashi say Loy lakhu musar? Because he's coming to tell us that the lesson is there for the taking. They just saw exactly how to behave and how not to behave, and they didn't take the lesson. And because if we're saying that they could have taken a lesson, it means that the sins are similar. So then a person can think that also the people involved are similar. So Rashi emphasizes that there's no similarity whatsoever by saying Urishayim halalu. They were completely and totally opposite of Miriam. They were Rishayim, whereas Miriam, on the other hand, we see and we just saw how great she was. And we'll explain in the next section how the sins are similar, and so that's the severity that they just saw this thing happening, and nevertheless they didn't take the readily available lesson of how not to behave. Now we're going to move on to explain what was the sin of Miriam and how it's similar to the sin of the Meraglim. And in the process, we're also going to answer question number 2. In question number 2, we asked, why does Rashi say Shaloksa al Iske Diba and not Shaloksa al Lashon Hara? So we're going to start by asking a question over here, which is, l'chayra, seemingly it's not understood. What indeed was the sin of Miriam? What Miriam said about Moshe, Oidis Isha Kushis Asher Lokach, and Va'ata Gersho, that now Moshe Rabbeinu divorced his wife. It was true. He divorced her and he caused her pain. In addition, Miriam didn't even intend to speak badly about Moshe, like Rashi tells us. So she didn't have bad intentions, and what she said was true. And it's just that she didn't correctly estimate the greatness of Moshe, that it was more than just Moshe Dibur Hashem, just like Hashem spoke to them. And so she thought that Moshe shouldn't have separated from his wife. And so the question is, did she deserve such a punishment for not knowing the true greatness of Moshe? So Rashi tells us that her sin was not in Diba Raya. It's not the Lashon Hara, but rather in Iske Diba. The very fact that she was Isaac in Diba, in speaking at length about Moshe, that was the problem. What does it mean? When Miriam saw Moshe behaving in a way that she didn't understand, she shouldn't have spoken about it, and certainly not in a way of askos, even though it was the truth and leiniskaven l'gnusay. A askos, meaning being preoccupied and talking about it at great length, of speaking about Moshe, it doesn't bring to Diba Teva. It can only lead to the opposite. So that was the chait, that was the sin of Miriam. Her askos in this type of speech, regardless of whether she had bad intentions or not, and regardless of whether it was true or not, it could only lead to bad things. And so she should not have done that. She shouldn't have been Isaac and Diba, and that was her sin. And if somebody says, what about if she wants to simply understand the conduct of Moshe? So for that, she should have asked them about it as an inquiry, just inquiring by Moshe about it, and in private. And similar to this was the sin of the Meraglim. They didn't say any lies about Eretz Yisrael, but they spoke in a way of Iske Diba. They spoke so much and at such great length and detail about the might of the people of Eretz Yisrael, to the extent that they scared the Yidden from wanting to go into Eretz Yisrael. That's a similarity. This Asik, this speaking at great length and detail about something that could only lead to problems. And in the case of the Meraglim, the problem was such a tremendous problem that it caused the Yidden to be afraid to enter Eretz Yisrael. And if they wondered how Hashem is commanding them to enter Eretz Yisrael, if the people are so strong, so they should have spoken about it in short, or simply ask Moshe. But this askos of speaking so extensively about the might of the people of Eretz Yisrael, to the extent that they came to the conclusion of Leinuchal Ales, could only lead Yidden to rebel and to say, Nitna Reish v'Neshuva Mitzrayma. And so here we see the similarity between the two Averis, and why Rashi says Iske Diba, because the issue was the speaking extensively about the matter, not that it was specifically Lashon Hara. And we could also understand over here as well the complete difference between them, that this askos of the Meraglim and their Dibur was such an askos that would lead, and could only lead, to the terrible results that it led to. Now we're going to move on to explain another detail of the sin of Miriam and the sin of the Meraglim, which is also a similarity between them. And based on that, we're also going to understand the severity of the sin of the Meraglim. And in the process, we're also going to answer question number 3. Question number 3 was, why does Rashi say Shedibur ba'achiyah? What's the difference? Who she spoke about? All that seems to matter is Shalok Sal Iske Diba, that she was punished for Iske Diba. Vehim Ro v'loy lakhu musar. They saw and didn't take a lesson. So how indeed did it come about that Miriam spoke Diba about Moshe? So this is understood by her words. She said, Harak ach b'Moshe Dibur Hashem. Did Hashem only speak with Moshe? Haloi gam banu Dibur. He also spoke with us, meaning Miriam and Aaron. So, meaning that knowing that Hashem also spoke with them caused that she didn't understand that Moshe's greatness over them was so immense, to the extent that it should justify freeing him of the tzivay of Hashem of a nasa lo yigra, that a person shouldn't leave their wife in that way, and causing pain to a isha kushis, which it says about her shana bakel, that she was a very special woman and she was beautiful in everything. And similarly was by the Meraglim. They thought that since Moshe chose them al pi Hashem, so therefore nobody is more qualified or greater than them in this shlichus. And therefore they said, since we saw ourselves as insects compared to the people of the land of Eretz Yisrael, so they were certain that according to Hashem, this was true by all Yidden. And so they came to the conclusion that loy nucha lales. And therefore, since they couldn't understand how they could go to Eretz Yisrael, so they were oisik in explaining this at length, which is the matter of Debo, we said. And they spoke negatively about Eretz Yisrael. So here we have another aspect of the sin in terms of seeing where it came from, which was similar between Miriam and the Meraglim, that both of them didn't appreciate their level compared to Moshe. Miriam compared herself to Moshe, and the Meraglim thought that they were on the highest level when it comes to this matter of their shlichus. And so whatever they experience is true, that is the truth in Torah. And according to this, we could understand why Rashi adds Dibra ba'achia, because this explains even more how the spies leilak musar. It emphasizes the severity that they didn't take a lesson. They had a readily and easily available lesson. They didn't take this lesson from Miriam in properly estimating another who is greater than them. By Miriam, there was the detail that Dibra ba'achia, that Moshe was her brother, who it says about a brother that it's chatzi b'sarei. And so it's naturally difficult for a person to feel about their own brother, who on one hand is chatzi b'sarei, that very brother is also infinitely greater than oneself. And nevertheless, even though Miriam had this excuse, she had this explanation that it's simply naturally difficult for a person to see their sibling both as chatzi b'sarei and as infinitely greater than them. And nevertheless, Miriam received the punishment for this. So certainly the Meraglim, that weren't allowed to think that all the Yidden, including Moshe and Aaron and everyone else, should follow their opinion and conclusion, certainly by them, they should have taken this lesson. So they had a readily and easily available lesson, and they saw that even Miriam, who had a great justification, that naturally it's difficult to have this type of understanding, nevertheless she was punished. And still in all, they didn't take this lesson for themselves to realize that they're not greater than Moshe and Aaron and many of the other Yidden. Now we're going to answer another question on Rashi, which is, why does Rashi say Urusharim halalu ra'u? Why doesn't he just say Urusharim halalu loy lakhu musar? Why does he say ra'u v'loy lakhu musar? And we're going to answer this by asking and answering another question about the spies. So another precise detail in the wording of Rashi is that he says Urusharim halalu ra'u v'loy lakhu musar. And l'chayra, the word ra'u is extra. So we'll understand this by first answering another difficulty on the story of the Meraglim. And that is, what changed by the Meraglim through going to Eretz Yisrael? And it changed to such an extent that they became so frightened, and it brought them to say, Loi luchalalis. They already knew about all the details of the land and the people of Eretz Yisrael, as is understood from a number of different proofs that they were aware of it. For example, it says, by Oz Yashar, they speak about how the people of the land became terrified. And if they weren't aware of the might of those people, what's the big deal that they were terrified? And there was other proofs as well to indicate this. And so the question is, what changed by them through going to Eretz Yisrael? So this will be understood based on the Maimer Chazal, that Eina Doime Shmiel L'Re'iyah. You can't compare when somebody hears something to when they see something, even if they believe it 100%. In terms of the impact of where it touches the person, you can't compare it. And so as long as they only heard about the might of the people of Eretz Yisrael, they weren't intimidated, and they were ready to go to Eretz Yisrael. However, when they saw the might of the people, that caused them to regret their previous decision. And that's why the Meraglim constantly emphasized that they saw all of this. They kept on saying, Ra'inu, we saw, and they also, it says, Vayarim, they showed the Yidden the fruits, because that's what essentially changed. They went from a place of hearing about the might of the people to seeing it. And that seeing of the might made them change their understanding and their feelings about their ability to conquer the land of Eretz Yisrael. And therefore Rashi emphasizes that they also saw the lesson. And since they saw the lesson, it should have given them the strength to overcome the challenge of being intimidated by what they saw in Eretz Yisrael. Because if they had only heard about the punishment of Miriam, they didn't see it, they just heard about it. So then we couldn't demand that they should have taken the lesson, because this is a lesson which is distant from them. They heard about it. So you can't expect them to and demand of them that they should take the lesson, since the cause of the sin came from seeing, and the strength to overcome it came from hearing. And therefore Rashi emphasizes that they saw the lesson. That also the strength to overcome this challenge was by seeing, and nevertheless, they didn't take the lesson. And so with this we answer all of our questions and get an understanding of what is the sin of the Meraglim. Ultimately, the sin of the Meraglim was that they they themselves saw, and in a way of seeing, even though what they saw in Eretz Yisrael was very powerful, but they also saw this lesson that they could take from Miriam about the danger of talking about something at great length. And also the cause of that, their estimation of their greatness, just like Miriam made an estimation of her greatness compared to Moshe. And they made that same mistake of their estimation of their greatness, and they didn't have the difficulty that Miriam had, that it's her brother, so it's hard to see him as being so much greater. They didn't have that difficulty, and still they didn't take that lesson, and they went ahead and they were Isaac and Diba about this matter of entering Eretz Yisrael, which could lead, and as we saw, did lead. We said that's the only thing that it could lead to, that the people would be afraid to go into Eretz Yisrael and would rebel, and nevertheless, even though the lesson was readily available, and it just occurred, and they had it in a way of seeing it, and they didn't have the difficulty that Miriam had, and they saw that Miriam, even despite this difficulty, still got a punishment, and they that didn't have this difficulty should certainly overcome it, and still they didn't take the lesson, and so that's what's so terrible about the sin of the Meraglim. From the Inyanim B'Floim and Allah and Rashi, starting with a question. Despite everything we said, how does the Torah put the story of Miriam near the story of the Meraglim, which can lead to the chashad, the suspicion, that Miriam is somewhat similar to the Meraglim? So seemingly we can answer, according to the opinion of Rashi, in what he says on the Torah, meaning not necessarily in Gemara or elsewhere, that we follow the opinion that the Torah was Megillah Nitna, meaning that Moshe immediately wrote each parsha, and not that it was written all at once. As the events occurred, Moshe wrote the Parshas. So according to this, it makes sense that Moshe wrote the beginning of Parsha Shelach, which is just about the sending of the Meraglim. He wrote it right away. Now it's understood that between these two stories, there were thousands of events that occurred. And so the closeness of the Parshas was only in writing. It's not that they happened near one another. It's just that Moshe wrote them in a way that they're close to one another, and therefore Moshe overlooked placing the stories together, despite it possibly leading to a suspicion about Miriam, and he did this in order to try to protect the Meraglim. So it's only because of this understanding that the Moshe wrote the Torah in such a way of Megillah Nitna, and so as each thing occurred, he wrote it. So he wrote the story of the sending of the Meraglim, not their Avera even. He wrote the story of the sending of the Meraglim right away, and it's not even that they're close in all regards, because since he wrote the parshas as they occurred, so between the two parshas there were many events that happened. However, it remains difficult. There's a rule that we say, Ein oimrim leila adam chata b'shvil sheyiska chavercha. We don't tell one person to do an avera so to benefit another person. And so Rashi answers this by writing v'loi lakhu musar and not v'loi chatu. So this is the Inyanim of Flaim and Allah and Rashi. That Rashi doesn't say Urushaim halalu ra'u v'chatu, but rather ra'u v'lei lakhu musar. What's he telling us with this? So the explanation is as follows. Rashi explains on the teaching when it says in the Gemara, Ein oimrim leil adam chata b'shvil sheyiska chavercha. We don't tell one person to do an avera for the benefit of another person. So Rashi says that it means shelo yischayev chavercha einish chamer. We don't tell a person to do an avera to benefit the other person that he shouldn't get a severe punishment. And so there's a difficulty over here. It's not understood. Rashi should have said so that your fellow doesn't do a more severe sin. He should have written shelo yischayev chavercha or shelo yaver chavercha al avera chamura. We don't tell a person to do even a small sin in order to avoid another person doing a big sin. So why does he speak of a severe punishment? Why does Rashi speak of a punishment? So we can answer that Rashi follows the opinion in Taisvus that Ein Oimrim, this teaching of Ein Oimrim, is only when the sin was already done. If the sin is already done and all that's involved is that if the person doesn't intervene, there'll be a great punishment. So we tell the person, you don't do even a small sin despite it helping and saving someone else from a big punishment. However, when it comes to protecting one's fellow that he shouldn't do the severe sin, so then Taisvus says, we do tell a person to do a small avera to help and avoid another person doing a great avera, to protect another person from a severe sin. And according to this, it's understood why the Torah places Miriam in a position that may lead to a suspicion that she was like the Meraglim, because this was supposed to help the Meraglim, not to come to do the avera in the first place. And so this is the Inyanim of Flaim and Halacha, that we do tell a person to do a small sin, that another fellow, another yid, should be saved from doing a big avera. And Rashi hints to this by writing because the whole purpose of what they saw is to help protect them from not doing the avera at all. To avoid, not the Shem Halalu Ra'u V'chatu, but they didn't take Musar. And since it had the ability to give them Musar, to give them a lesson, so then it's appropriate to put Miriam in such a position for the benefit, the potential benefit of the Meraglim.